rain had not stopped for days. It poured in steady sheets over the countryside as if the sky itself were trying to drown the land beneath. Dr. Evelyn Hartman sat in the back of the rusting Model A, her gloved fingers gripping the worn leather of her briefcase. The car rattled as it climbed the muddy road, winding ever deeper into the fog-shrouded hills. Blackmore Asylum, she had been told, was a relic of a different time. Built in the 1800s, it had once been a grand estate before it was converted into a hospital for the mentally ill. Now, in 1935, it was a place of whispers, where doctors came and went, and patients were forgotten. As the asylum's iron gates loomed into view, Evelyn felt a tightness in her chest. The building itself rose like a looming shadow against the gray sky, its stone facade slick with rain, ivy creeping along its walls like grasping fingers. Its windows were dark, save for a few dimly lit rooms that flickered weakly through the storm. The driver, a silent, sallow man, brought the car to a shuddering stop at the entrance. Evelyn stepped out, clutching her hat against the wind. The rain bit at her skin as she hurried up the stone steps toward the massive oak doors, which creaked open as she approached. She was greeted by an older woman in a nurse's uniform, her expression as dour as the weather. "Dr. Hartman, I presume?" The nurse's voice was hollow, the words tinged with something that might have been regret. "Yes," Evelyn replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm here to take over as the lead psychiatrist." The nurse nodded but said nothing further. She turned and gestured for Evelyn to follow her inside. The grand foyer of Blackmore was once, perhaps, a symbol of luxury, but now it was dark and oppressive. The high ceilings and marble floors echoed with the steady drip of rainwater seeping through the roof. There was a dampness in the air, thick and suffocating, as if the building itself exhaled decay. "The staff quarters are upstairs. Your office is ready," the nurse said, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "The director will see you in the morning. For now, rest." Evelyn followed her through winding corridors that seemed to stretch on forever, each turn leading to more shadows, more closed doors. The air was thick with a strange tension, a silence that hummed with an almost tangible weight. As they passed one of the wings, she heard it, the faintest whisper, a soft, trembling voice that seemed to rise from the walls themselves. Her footsteps faltered, and she glanced toward the door from which the sound had come. Ward C. The placard was barely legible, worn with age. Behind the door she could make out shapes, figures moving slowly, almost lethargically, in the dim glow of a single light bulb. "Ward C," the nurse muttered, her voice just above a whisper. "Stay clear of it, Doctor. Hartman. Only the most disturbed patients are kept there. It's better not to ask." Evelyn swallowed, nodding silently. They moved past the ward, the whispers fading into the distance, though they seemed to linger in her ears long after. Her room was at the far end of the hall, small but sufficient. The window looked out onto the asylum grounds, overgrown, wild, the trees bent and twisted like old bones. She set her briefcase down on the bed, her mind buzzing with questions. The journey had left her exhausted, but sleep felt impossible in a place like this. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the window, and the wind howled like a living thing. As Evelyn unpacked, her fingers brushed against something cold. She pulled an old brass key from her coat pocket, frowning. It hadn't been there before. She stared at it, the metal gleaming faintly in the dim light. A chill crept up her spine, and from somewhere in the distance, the whispers began again. This time, they were calling her name. The following morning, a pale sun struggled to break through the heavy clouds, casting a sickly light over the asylum grounds. Dr. Evelyn Hartman rose early, her sleep troubled by vivid dreams of shadowy figures and distant voices. She could still hear the whispers in her mind, though now they felt like fragments of memory, not quite real. Yet, when she looked at the brass key on her bedside table, she felt the same uneasy chill. Determined to shake off the strange tension, she dressed and made her way to the administrative office. The director, a thin, balding man named Dr. Langdon, greeted her with a forced smile. His office, much like the rest of Blackmore, was dark and unwelcoming, its windows draped with heavy curtains that blocked out the daylight. "Dr. Hartman," Langdon said, motioning for her to sit. "I trust your accommodations are suitable." "They're fine," she replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I'd like to discuss my patient assignments." Yes, of course." He shuffled through a stack of yellowing papers on his desk, clearing his throat. "You'll be overseeing several patients in Ward C, our most challenging cases. I'm aware you were informed last night." Evelyn's stomach tightened. "Ward C, I was told the patients there are disturbed." Langdon's eyes flicked toward the door, his smile slipping for a moment. "Ward C is different. The patients suffer from severe hysteria, but not in the way you're accustomed to. These aren't ordinary cases of mental illness. There have been incidents." "What kind of incidents?" His eyes were hollow when they met hers, as if what he saw in them haunted him still. "Patients speaking languages they've never learned, recounting events they could never have witnessed, and always, the whispers. They're not dangerous physically, but the influence they seem to be under is unlike anything we've seen before." Evelyn nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. Despite the pit growing in her stomach, she felt compelled to see for herself. "I'd like to visit Ward C," Dr. Langdon hesitated. "If you insist. Nurse Merrick will accompany you." Minutes later, Evelyn and Nurse Merrick stood outside the heavy wooden doors of Ward C. The air seemed to thicken around them, a strange pressure that made her ears hum. As Merrick unlocked the door, Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Inside, the ward was unnaturally quiet. The long, narrow hallway was lined with barred doors, each one revealing a small, dimly lit cell. Most of the patients were motionless, sitting on their beds or curled into corners, their faces turned away from the light. The silence was palpable, as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. "This is Ward C," Nurse Merrick said quietly. "They don't speak, not to us anyway." Evelyn approached one of the cells and peered inside. A woman sat on the edge of her bed, her back rigid, staring at the wall. Her hands were clasped in her lap, fingers twitching as if performing a delicate, invisible task. Her face, gaunt and pale, was expressionless, but her eyes, glassy and wide, were full of something dark, something unspoken. "Agnes," Merrick whispered. "She's been here the longest. She won't talk, just stares." Evelyn moved closer, her voice soft. "Agnes, can you hear me?" Agnes didn't respond, but her hands stopped moving, her fingers curling slowly into fists. Then, with deliberate slowness, she turned her head. Her eyes locked onto Evelyn's, and something passed between them, something cold and ancient. Then Agnes lifted her hand and began to trace shapes in the air, her lips parting in a slow, deliberate motion. Though no sound emerged, Evelyn could almost hear the words. The shapes she traced were familiar, too familiar. It was the same motion she had made in her dream the night before, the same shape that had been etched into her mind. Evelyn took a step back, her pulse quickening. What is she doing? She's been drawing those patterns for weeks, Merrick said, her voice tight with discomfort. It's like she's trying to write something. Suddenly, Agnes's hand dropped and she lurched forward. She slammed her fists against the door, her mouth moving furiously now. No sound came, but the intent was clear. She was screaming. Evelyn stumbled back, her heart racing. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the air around her, pressing into her mind. From the other cells, the patients began to move, their bodies jerking to life as if responding to Agnes's silent screams. They turned toward Evelyn, their eyes wide and unblinking, mouths forming soundless words. The whispers grew louder, echoing in the corridor, pulling her toward the cell doors. "Dr. Hartman," Merrick urged, her voice taut with fear. "We need to leave. Now." But Evelyn couldn't move. The whispers were inside her head now, each one calling her name in a voice that was not her own. And then, as if obeying some unseen command, all the patients fell silent again, all except Agnes, who slowly, deliberately, traced a single word in the air. "Run." The word "run" haunted Dr. Evelyn Hartman as she left Ward C. The cold stillness of the corridor gnawed at her nerves, the oppressive silence broken only by the soft click of Nurse Merrick's heels against the stone floor. Outside the ward, she took a deep breath, but the chill that had settled in her bones refused to leave. As they made their way back to the main halls, Nurse Merrick's face remained pale, her eyes darting nervously around, as if expecting the very walls to shift. Evelyn's mind was whirling with questions, but she knew Merrick wouldn't offer answers. There was something about Blackmore, something everyone refused to speak about. The patients weren't the only ones suffering here. The staff seemed gripped by the same uneasy silence, a tension that thickened the air. Before she could ask Merrick any more questions, a shout echoed down the corridor. Two orderlies came running toward them, their expressions wild with panic. "He's gone!" one of them yelled, barely catching his breath. "Morris is gone!" Merrick stiffened. "Gone? Where? What happened?" The other orderly, a younger man with wide, frightened eyes, shook his head. "He was on his shift in the East Wing last night. Everything was normal, but this morning his bed was empty and his coat and things were still in the dormitory. He just vanished." Evelyn frowned, her heart quickening. "Have you searched the grounds? The basement?" "Everywhere," the first orderly replied, his face pale. "There's no sign of him." Merrick exchanged a glance with Evelyn, her voice low. "This isn't the first time." "What do you mean?" Evelyn asked, her unease growing. Merrick hesitated, her lips pressing together tightly. Finally she spoke, her voice just above a whisper. "Orderlies have been disappearing for months now. They're here one day, and the next, they're gone. No one talks about it, but there have been at least 4 that we know of. We report it to Dr. Langdon, but he..." She faltered, glancing around before finishing in a whisper. "He does nothing, just files reports. Then we all pretend it never happened." The second orderly, pale and shaking, looked as though he might collapse. "Morris said he heard something the night before, a voice. He said it was like someone calling to him, but no one else was there." A chill ran down Evelyn's spine, the whispers. Could they have lured Morris to his fate? "Did anyone check Ward C?" Evelyn asked, her voice quieter now, suspicion rising. The young orderly's face went blank with fear, and he shook his head violently. "No one goes near that ward unless absolutely necessary." Merrick looked at Evelyn. "Ward C is secure, Dr. Hartman." But her words trailed off, and she glanced down the darkened hallway toward the eastern wing. A thick tension clung to the air, a creeping unease that wormed its way into Evelyn's thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that Blackmore was hiding something far worse than disappearing staff members or hysterical patients. Something alive in the walls whispering to those vulnerable enough to listen. "I'm going to look into it," Evelyn said, more to herself than to anyone else. She needed answers. But as she turned to leave, Merrick's hand shot out, gripping her arm. "You won't find anything, Doctor." "Hartman," she said softly, her voice trembling. "The ones who disappear are never found." Evelyn stared at her, taken aback by the sudden desperation in her eyes. Merrick let go, stepping back as though regretting the outburst. She glanced toward the other orderlies and straightened her uniform, her mask of composure slipping back into place. But Evelyn's curiosity had been piqued. Why was no one searching for the missing orderlies? Why was there no investigation, no inquiry? It was as though Blackmore had swallowed them whole, leaving only cold rumors and fear in their wake. Later that day, Evelyn returned to her office, her thoughts swirling with the strange events of the morning. She opened the window, hoping the fresh air might clear her head, but the air outside was just as thick, the trees swaying under a sky heavy with clouds. From her desk, she could see the iron gates of Blackmore, their rusted bars barely visible through the mist. A suffocating sense of isolation hung over the asylum, as though it had been cut off from the rest of the world long ago. As she prepared to sit, her eyes caught something, a small leather-bound journal, half hidden beneath a pile of old papers. She didn't remember placing it there. Slowly, she reached for it, her fingers tracing the worn cover. It wasn't hers. Opening the journal, she saw handwriting scrawled across the yellowing pages. Names, dates, brief descriptions. Some pages were torn, smudged with what looked like water stains, or perhaps something darker. The names listed were unfamiliar at first, but as she flipped further, a cold realization crept in. They were the names of the missing orderlies: Morris, Johnston, Palmer, and beneath each name, a single phrase written in jagged script, "Taken by the voices." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She stared at the words, the meaning clawing at her mind. Taken by the voices. The whispers had called to the orderlies. They had lured them away just like they had called to her. And as the wind howled outside her window, Evelyn thought she heard them again. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. The whispers were back. Evelyn sat frozen at her desk, her eyes fixed on the scrawled words in the journal. Taken by the voices. She could almost feel the weight of those words pressing down on her chest, each breath coming slower than the last. Outside, the wind rattled the old window frames, but it was the quiet, persistent hum in the back of her mind, the whispers, that unsettled her more. It was as if the voices she had heard since stepping into Blackmore were drawing closer, eager to be understood. Determined to make sense of it all, Evelyn flipped to the back of the journal, hoping for more details. Toward the last few pages, the writing changed, becoming messier, more frantic. Notes about strange occurrences, patients behaving erratically, and mentions of something called the initiative. But most disturbing of all were the repeated references to the basement. She leaned back in her chair, the journal trembling in her hands. Blackmore's basement was supposed to be sealed off, part of the original building, long forgotten and unused, or so she had been told. But the journal seemed to suggest otherwise. If these experiments were connected to the whispers, then the basement might hold the answers she so desperately needed. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Startled, Evelyn quickly shoved the journal back under the papers just as Dr. Langdon entered the room. His usual grim expression was softened by a forced smile, but his eyes were as cold and hollow as ever. "Dr. Hartman," he greeted her, glancing around her office with mild curiosity. "I trust you're settling in well?" "Yes, thank you," she replied cautiously, her mind racing. Did he know about the journal? About the disappearances? She forced herself to remain calm. "I was wondering about the basement of the asylum. Is it true that it's sealed off?" Langdon's smile faded slightly, his fingers fidgeting with the lapels of his coat. "The basement has been closed for years. There's no need to concern yourself with it. Your work is in Ward C. Those patients need your attention." "Of course," Evelyn said, carefully choosing her words. "But I've read some notes about previous research being conducted in the basement. I'd like to know more about it. What was the initiative?" Langdon's face drained of color, and for a moment a flicker of fear crossed his eyes before he regained his composure. He moved toward the window, his back to her, staring out at the bleak, rain-soaked grounds. "That was a long time ago," he said, his voice tight. "A failed experiment, nothing more. Some of the early doctors here believed they could cure madness through unconventional means. But it went too far, and we lost more than we gained." His words hung in the air, laden with something unspoken. The tension in the room was palpable, and Evelyn could feel the distance growing between them. "What exactly did they lose?" she asked quietly. Langdon hesitated, then turned to face her, his expression darkening. "You're digging into things best left buried, Doctor Hartman. Blackmore's history is one of failure, of tragedy. The patients in Ward C were affected by those early experiments. You need to focus on their care, not the past." Evelyn's pulse quickened. He was hiding something far worse than she had imagined. "Do the whispers have anything to do with this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Langdon's jaw tightened. "I suggest you tread carefully, Doctor Hartman. Some doors should remain closed." With that, he left the room, the door shutting with a sharp finality. Evelyn sat still for a moment, her mind racing. Langdon knew more than he was letting on. The initiative, the basement, the whispers. It was all connected, and the director was deliberately keeping it from her. But why? She stood up, her determination renewed. She needed to get to the basement. If the whispers had come from there, if those early experiments had unleashed something terrible, then she had to see it for herself. There was no turning back now. That evening, after the asylum had quieted and most of the staff had retired for the night, Evelyn made her move. The journal had mentioned an entrance to the basement near the east wing, where Morris had disappeared. Armed with a flashlight and a resolve strengthened by fear, she made her way down the darkened corridors, the old floorboards creaking beneath her feet. When she reached the east wing, the air felt different, thicker, colder. Her flashlight beam wavered as she scanned the walls, finally spotting a narrow, hidden door, half concealed behind a stack of unused equipment. It looked ancient, its wood rotting at the edges, but the lock was clean and new. Her fingers brushed the brass key she had found in her coat pocket, the one that hadn't belonged to her. Heart-pounding, she slid the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. The door creaked open, revealing a set of stone stairs spiraling down into the darkness below. A faint, almost imperceptible sound reached her ears. Faint whispers, beckoning from the depths. Swallowing her fear, Evelyn descended the steps, her flashlight cutting through the blackness. The cold stone walls seemed to close in around her, the air growing damper with each step. At the bottom, she found a narrow hallway, lined with rusted metal doors. The whispers grew louder, and then she saw it, an old operating room at the end of the corridor, its door slightly ajar. Something was waiting for her there. She stepped inside, the cold grip of fear tightening around her heart, and the whispers surged, filling the room with voices not of this world. On the far wall, etched in the crumbling plaster, was a single message, scratched out by a trembling hand. They never left. Evelyn stared at the words etched into the wall. They never left. Her breath caught in her throat, the weight of the message settling over her like a shroud. The air in the basement was thick with moisture and an unshakable sense of dread, as if the very walls were alive, pulsing with the memories of those long forgotten. The whispers, once faint, now echoed louder, swirling around her, slipping into her thoughts like serpents. Shining her flashlight over the room, she saw that it was a place of horrors, a forgotten operating theater. Rusted medical instruments lay scattered on dusty tables, their jagged edges catching the dim light. The smell of old decay clung to the air, and Evelyn's stomach churned at the sight of bloodstains, long dried but still stark against the cold stone floor. In the center of the room was a rusting operating table, its leather straps cracked and worn. A thick layer of dust coated everything, but underneath, she could sense that someone had disturbed this place recently. Her heart raced as she recalled Dr. Langdon's warning. Some doors should remain closed, yet here she was, facing the undeniable evidence of Blackmore's darkest secret. This room wasn't just an abandoned experiment, it was the epicenter of the madness that had consumed the asylum. The whispers were stronger here, more coherent, though still just out of reach, as if they were voices trapped in the walls, desperate to escape. Evelyn stepped closer to the operating table, her flashlight revealing a tattered notebook lying beneath it. She knelt down, dusting it off with trembling hands. The pages were brittle and yellowed, filled with scribbled notes that became more and more erratic as they progressed. Diagrams of human brains, strange symbols, and sketches of machines she had never seen before littered the margins. And then, in the same jagged handwriting as the journal she'd found earlier, came the most unsettling entries. The patients can hear them. They speak to them. At first we thought it was hysteria, but now we know the truth. They're coming through the walls. The voices, once whispers, now commands. Evelyn's pulse quickened. The voices weren't just delusions. They were real. Her eyes skimmed further down the page. The experiment wasn't supposed to go this far. We were trying to access their subconscious, to open a door into their minds, but we opened something else instead. A doorway, a portal, the things on the other side. They want to come through, and the patients, they're the ones who let them in. Suddenly, the room seemed to close in around her. She could feel eyes on her, though there was no one else there. Or was there? The whispering grew louder, more frantic now. Shadows flickered in the corners of her vision, dark shapes slithering along the walls as if drawn to her presence. A sudden bang shattered the silence, and Evelyn spun around, her flashlight beam trembling as it landed on the door. It had swung shut, trapping her inside the basement. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat loud and frantic in the suffocating stillness. The whispers were all around her now, angry, pleading, desperate. Words swirled in her mind, incoherent but insistent. She backed away from the door, her breath shallow and uneven, when suddenly, something cold brushed against her skin. She gasped, spinning toward the operating table. But nothing was there. Still, the touch lingered, like fingers tracing her arm, a presence unseen. A low, guttural voice broke through the cacophony of whispers, clear and unmistakable this time. "We are waiting." Evelyn stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. The beam flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows across the room as the whispers surged in intensity. The walls seemed to pulse, vibrating with the energy of the voices, the room itself warping as if reality was starting to fray. Her back hit the wall, and she felt something cold beneath her fingers. She looked down and saw the same symbols from the journal, etched into the stone, the patterns twisted and dark. They were everywhere, woven into the very structure of Blackmore. This place wasn't just haunted by the whispers, it had become them. The asylum was their conduit, their vessel, and she was trapped inside. The voice returned, louder this time. "Open the door." A chill ran down Evelyn's spine. The basement door was locked, but she knew that wasn't the door the voices meant. The patients had heard it too. Agnes had tried to warn her. They were all being used, manipulated by something beyond comprehension, something that had been unleashed by the forgotten experiment. The doorway to whatever was on the other side had already been opened once, and now it wanted her to open it again. Desperate, she scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She had to get out of here, had to warn the others. But as she reached for the door handle, the whispers surged, filling her head with a single command that shook her to her core. "Let us in." The lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness for just a moment. And in that moment, Evelyn saw them, figures barely visible in the shadows crawling out from the walls, their hands reaching, their mouths open in silent screams. She bolted for the door, wrenching it open with all her strength, and stumbled into the narrow hallway beyond. The voices roared behind her, furious, and as she fled up the stairs, she could still hear them, closer now, almost touching her. "You can't escape us." The basement door slammed shut behind her, and the asylum fell silent once more. But the whispers remained, echoing in her mind, relentless. The door had been opened, and there was no way to close it again. Evelyn's footsteps echoed through the empty halls of Blackmore, her breath ragged as she struggled to compose herself. The whispers still clawed at the edges of her mind, no matter how hard she tried to push them away. She had barely escaped the basement, but the sense of dread that followed her felt heavier with each step. The asylum wasn't just haunted by the past. It was alive with something far more sinister, something that had been waiting for years to be unleashed. Her mind raced as she made her way toward C, the brass key she'd found earlier burning in her pocket like a hot coal. She had to confront the truth, face whatever was controlling the patients. Agnes had tried to warn her. The other patients had whispered their warnings in the dead of night, but Evelyn had ignored them. Now she could feel it. Blackmore had swallowed her whole. Ward C was eerily quiet when she arrived. The same flickering light bulbs cast long shadows down the hallway, but something was different. The air was colder, and the oppressive weight she had felt before had grown. The whispers, no longer distant, now seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves, like a heartbeat thrumming just below the surface. As she passed the cells, the patients were no longer sitting in their usual, vacant silence. They stood at their barred windows, their hollow eyes fixed on her, watching as she moved. Their lips moved soundlessly, mouthing words she could not hear, but she knew the voices were not their own. A loud clang from further down the hall made her jump. She rushed toward the sound, her pulse quickening as she neared Agnes's cell. The door was ajar, swinging slowly on its hinges. "Agnes?" Evelyn called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer. She stepped into the cell cautiously, her flashlight sweeping across the small, cold room. Agnes was not there, but the walls were covered in more of the strange, frenzied symbols, etched into the stone with what looked like blood. The bed was torn apart, the sheets shredded and piled in a corner like a makeshift nest, and on the floor, drawn in thick, dark lines, was the same symbol she had seen in the basement, the twisted, jagged circle that seemed to pulse with dark energy. As she knelt down to inspect it, she heard a faint sound, like the rustle of fabric, and looked up just in time to see Agnes standing in the doorway. Her eyes, wide and vacant, stared right through Evelyn. Her lips twitched, as though she was trying to speak, but no sound came out. Evelyn stood slowly, her heart pounding. "Agnes, can you hear me?" The woman's head tilted slightly, her mouth moving faster now, whispering something so faint that it seemed to dissolve in the air. Evelyn stepped closer, straining to hear. That's when she saw it. Behind Agnes, the shadows in the hallway twisted unnaturally, as though they were alive. Dark, shifting figures moved within the blackness, their forms human but grotesque, their eyes glowing faintly with a malevolent light. They were coming from the walls, just as the journal had warned, the spirits of those taken by the voices, the ones who had never left. Agnes's hand shot out, grabbing Evelyn's wrist with a surprising strength. Her eyes, filled with terror, locked onto Evelyn's. For a moment, her lips stopped moving, and a single word escaped them: "Run." Before Evelyn could react, the shadows surged forward. They moved faster than anything human, spilling into the room like a wave of darkness. The walls trembled, the whispers rising into a deafening chorus as the figures reached for her, their hands twisting through the air, grasping for her soul. Evelyn broke free from Agnes's grip and stumbled backward, her mind racing. The patients were trapped, not just by their madness, but by whatever entity Blackmore had unleashed. The spirits were no longer confined to the basement. They had taken over the asylum, possessing the living, using them as conduits for their rage. The lights flickered wildly as she fled the room, her pulse hammering in her ears. The patients in the cells began to scream, their voices joining the cacophony of the whispers, their eyes filled with the same terror that gripped her. She could feel the shadows closing in behind her, the malevolent presence pressing against her like a storm about to break. She reached the end of the hall and threw herself against the door toward C. It wouldn't budge. Frantically, she pounded on it, her breath coming in gasps. Behind her, the whispers grew louder, closer. The shadows were nearly upon her, their hands reaching out, cold and grasping. With a final burst of adrenaline, she grabbed the brass key from her pocket and jammed it into the lock. It turned with a loud click, and the door swung open. She tumbled out into the corridor, slamming the door behind her just as the shadows hit the other side, rattling the frame violently. For a moment, there was silence, but Evelyn knew it wasn't over. The spirits, whatever they were, had been waiting for years, and now they were free. Blackmore's walls had held them for decades, and now that the whispers had found their way out, there would be no stopping them. The asylum had always been their prison. Now, it was their hunting ground, and Evelyn knew deep down that she was next.